Awesome. All right, about ready to get started. How's everybody doing today? Wow, this is the interactive part of the session, guys. Haha, right. All right, so this is going to be a little bit of a different kind of a session because I'm not going to teach you anything about Angular. Okay, Angular conference, I'm not going to teach you anything about Angular. I figure you're getting that from all the other sessions at the conference. What I want to do is I kind of want to just draw your attention to something, and I want to explain to you why I think it's something you might want to pay attention to. And just as a quick little, I guess, a spoiler alert, is that it's going to put some extra money in your pockets as developers. How many people like that? Right? And the rest of you not raising your hand, you're just lazy, right? Developers, come on, man. So if you see me talking to myself or mumbling to myself throughout, if you saw me yesterday doing that or today, it's because I'm having a conversation with the person that came up with the title of this session and how dumb and how bad the title actually is. That's me. I'm the one that came up with that. So let me just kind of explain what I want to just talk to you about here, all right? You know, when you sit there and you say, we're going to be building these things with CORS, it's like, well, I mean, we're not building any services. We're taking advantage of services that are already there. And the way that this stuff works is that a service that supports CORS, if you're calling it, there's really nothing for you to do. It just happens, right? It just works. There's nothing the consumer really has to deal with. So there's not really a whole lot to show you in that respect. It's just saying, hey, look, they support CORS. Instead, what I want to talk to you a little bit about is about building Angular applications, but building secure applications, and then building them also to take advantage of things such as Office 365, the fastest growing product in the history of Microsoft. Now, if any of you are planning to come to my workshop that I'm doing tomorrow, just going to give you a bit of a heads up, what you're going to see here is like a small piece of what I'm doing tomorrow. So if you're coming to my workshop tomorrow, I don't really know what you're going to get out of this session because I'm going to do most of the same thing tomorrow as well. So if anybody wants to go bolt and run to another session, totally cool. I just wanted to save you some time there so you don't sit there tomorrow and go, didn't we see this? The sample that I'm going to show you is right there at that GitHub repo. So is the slide deck. You can grab everything from right there. I'll show it at the very end as well. Okay, so I'll leave it up there for just a half second here. Now, what I'm going to do here in this session, just a little bit of information about me. My name's Andrew Connell. I've lived in this world of SharePoint. How many of you have heard of SharePoint? How many of you have a good perception of SharePoint? Yeah. I don't either. I've been doing SharePoint since 12 years now, which is only reason I don't look like John Papa is because this is better living through chemistry. Okay, SharePoint's like driven me absolutely mad. I've done a lot of SharePoint development, but I do more like client-side development, more stuff that in a sense just talks to SharePoint or talks to other services that we have in Office 365, which I'll explain what that is in a minute. I have a podcast that I co-host with the guy that owns the developer story for Office 365 at Microsoft. It's called the Microsoft Cloud Show. And then I also do training. I'm a Pluralsight instructor and also do hands-on training with a company called Critical Path Training. Enough about that. What are we going to talk about? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on slides, and then I'm going to spend the more than half of the session on demo and just kind of walking through some code. You saw a sample that Dan Wallin and John Papa showed at one point yesterday when you saw all these cards of people, of employees and expenses and stuff. That's a sample that Dan and I worked on that I'm going to use in this demo. And what we did, we built that for Microsoft, and it's built using TypeScript and takes advantage of Azure Active Directory for authentication and security, and then also talks to Office 365. So I'm going to walk through that one. First, though, I want to spend a little bit of time, and to be quite blunt, it's not a sales pitch, but it's a little sales-ish or kind of marketecture-ish stuff at the very beginning, explaining what 365 is, and then talking about what Azure AD is, what the 365 APIs are, what you can do with them, why, as developers, you should really care about it, and then what Azure AD AL, what Azure Active Directory ADAL, what that is, and how you can take advantage of it. Before I dive into 365, how many of you are familiar with what Office 365 is? How many of you are using it today in your organization? Okay, so I see just a handful of people that are using it. What is this? So Office 365 is Microsoft's hosted story for a bunch of different products. It's hosted SharePoint, it's hosted Exchange, it's hosted Skype for Business, which you might have heard of before, called Link. It's hosted OneDrive for Business, which is Microsoft's enterprise version of Dropbox. There's a consumer version of OneDrive as well, but it's your file storage area. And then it's another thing called Yammer, which is their social networking story. Okay, so it's all of these things. They host it. You don't fork over a ton of money. It's all software as a service. You pay on a per-user license. Lots and lots of people are using this today. Why should you care about it? Well, as developers, I'm going to tell you that you should at least care about it a little bit because you're going to find that a lot of organizations are already in Office 365. Now, why does that matter? Well, I'll come back to that in just a second. These numbers are current as of May of this year, so just about a month ago. 80% of enterprises, so large cap companies, are using Office 365. Today, there's over 4 trillion emails in Office 365, over 830 million monthly meetings, almost 500 petabytes of storage. This is where companies have all of their collaboration information within their organization inside of Office 365 for their enterprise. It also contains all of their mailbox information, so companies that are on Exchange, all their contacts, their calendar, their emails, all of that stuff is inside of Office 365. In addition, file storage. You want to go through and store files and have like a Dropbox or an enterprise-style Dropbox with real security, with real group policy stuff that's set on it. A lot of companies are putting stuff in Office 365 and OneDrive for Business. You can put up to a terabyte of data in there, which is essentially an unlimited storage, right? It's always funny, they say, yeah, now you can put a terabyte in there. Really? Who's going to put a terabyte of information in like their Dropbox or in their Google Drive or whatever it is? The first time you install that client and you turn around and you have to try to take that stuff and say, I'm going to sync it down to my laptop, you just blew your hard drive, right? No more space. Okay, why should you care about this as a developer? Here's why I think that you should care about it as a developer, right? The reason why you should care about it as a developer is because these companies that have all their information in Office 365, they've already got all their data there, okay? When we build custom applications for businesses, they almost always want to have that stuff integrated in with the rest of their existing data that they're working with within the enterprise. Their contacts, their calendar, their email, their files. And there's a lot of other things too that we can touch on. What's nice about this is because it's already in 365 and because there's APIs that we can take advantage of, we build our custom business apps that we deploy for our customers. We can have those applications interface with all of that data and surface that data right in line. Makes our apps have a really good enterprise feel. Customers like paying for that stuff. This is like a low-hanging fruit for developers, and it pays really good right now, right? So it's something you should care about. Now, just kind of explain how do I like to think about this stuff? Well, when we talk about cloud platforms, there's essentially three different terms that we throw around. We throw around infrastructure as a service, IaaS, right? That's virtual machines that live in the cloud. So if you do Amazon Web Services or AWS, that's the product offering they have called EC2. If you do it with Azure, they have something called virtual machines. Another option is software as a service. That's what Office 365 is. That's what Salesforce is, right? That's what Google Apps is and Google Docs is. All that stuff, that's software as a service. You pay a subscription to use the product. The other one, though, is for developers. It's platform as a service. And what that is, it says that we as developers, we're going to get all these cool little building blocks and tinker toys that we can use to build up our own custom applications and take advantage of that inside of our custom apps. Each one of those different components scales independently of each other. We can do things like websites. We can do things like caching, database, queues, all sorts of stuff. Azure has a story for this. Amazon has a story for this. But the way I like to look at Office 365 is EPAS. Now, a lot of people are using Office 365 right out of the box as like software as a service. But as a developer, there's a lot of things that you can take advantage of with this. There's things like workflow. There's things like user profiles, which is data coming not only from your organization's Active Directory, but you can also aggregate other data from other sources within your enterprise and maybe outside of your enterprise to have a very rich user profile. That's not just the enterprise Active Directory stuff, but additional information that's added to it as well. Maybe some social stuff or stuff from Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn. There's a lot of different things that we can take advantage of. A metadata store, taxonomy store for our entire organization. These are all building blocks and components that have an end user component to them in Office 365 or in SharePoint or Exchange, but we can take advantage of them as individual components within our application. How many of us have built an application where we need to have some sort of taxonomy and tagging infrastructure, right? And then we have to store all the tags, and we have to organize all that stuff, and how are we going to search for it? I don't have to write search when I'm doing 365. There's a really robust search story that we have in Office 365. It's based on SharePoint, but it takes advantage of all that data, and it can search all that stuff. Why should I build that logic when instead I can just call an API that's going to take advantage of that for me? And it's all free. Just because I say ePaaS, unlike the standard PaaS stuff that we have like in Azure or AWS, where you pay based on a consumption model for each one of the different components you get, with Office 365, you're a user and you have access to all of this stuff, workflow, taxonomy, storage, files, all that stuff. You have access to all of it for your one subscription level that each user has. So you don't have to worry about how much is my application going to cost, right? It doesn't apply here. So I like to think of these Office 365 components as ePaaS. All right, so let's pivot over a little bit. That's the sales pitchy kind of side. What's the story for developers? How does this work? Well, traditionally in SharePoint, if you've heard some of the old baggage stuff about SharePoint where you build these .NET assemblies and you push them inside of SharePoint, and they have to run with special trust and all that stuff, and the deployment model sucks, none of that stuff applies really anymore. All right? What Microsoft has done in the last 2 or 3 years is they said, all of you developers, get out of SharePoint. We're going to instead have a platform, and then we're going to have a nice, robust set of APIs that your applications are going to talk to and they're going to leverage. All of these APIs you're going to talk to, it's all going to happen over REST. It's all founded on the OData v4 specification for the RESTful services that they have. So we have a nice predictable set of grammar and vocabulary that we can take advantage of. And all of the calls are going to have to be authenticated using standard OAuth 2 based authentication mechanisms, and the way you're going to authenticate passing a access token across in the header, in your request header. There's also native SDKs that Microsoft has offered. To me, this is like the most open. I don't know if you guys have noticed how Microsoft has gotten so much more open in the last year or two. Ever since Satya Nadella took over the company has just opened up. It's no longer, you have to be a Microsoft customer, you have to have everything. Now they're like, no, we don't care what you're using, as long as you're using one of our services, that's all that matters. This is one of the most open parts of the company that's been really energizing for me. You see native SDKs, not just for .NET, but for iOS, for Android. If you're doing cross-platform development, for Cordova or Xamarin, they have SDKs for all of those. I'm partial just to the REST API. That's a little bit easier for us to work with, specifically in the context of this conference. We're doing Angular, we're going to call RESTful services from the client. All right? And then all the APIs are going to be secured with Azure AD, because Office 365 is going to be built on top of Azure AD. All right, so what are the APIs that we have available to us? Now, just a little disclaimer here. Yes, I lifted this from one of their architecture slides from a recent conference. But what Microsoft has had is with Office 365 is we've had lots of little different API endpoints that we can go talk to get access to within our applications. We want to go to mail. We want to get messages out of the email. You go to the mail endpoint. You go to the contacts endpoint. You go to the calendar endpoint, the files endpoint. And it's been kind of a pain because every time you go to each one of these, you have to, the endpoints aren't predictable. So there's like this Yellow Pages service we call the Discovery service. We interrogate it saying, hey, what does Andrew have access to and where is everything? So it says, oh, here's all the APIs he can talk to, and here's what the URLs are for all those different endpoints. What they announced at their Microsoft's Build conference back in April is they have this new API called the Unified API. It's currently in preview mode, but they're still ramping it up and making it more and more robust, but it's good enough to use today. You'll find it at graph.microsoft.com. What's cool about this is this also conforms to the OData v4 specification, and you can get to everything inside, or you will ultimately get to everything inside of Office 365 and across the entire Microsoft stack through this one API. So if you think about it, you'll be able to get access to find a specific individual. So I can go to graph.microsoft.com. When it gets to version 1, it'll be /v1.0/ and then I could say me, and it would give me all the data that Microsoft knows about me. Kind of scary, right? Someone's like, yeah, isn't that scary? You find out what they know. I'm like, yeah, but now I kind of want to see if Google has the same kind of thing. Can I get to an API that shows, what do you know about me, right? I'd like to be able to see something like that. Anyway, once I get to my object, then I can go through and say, well, show me all the files that I have on my OneDrive for Business, or show me all the mail that I have in Office 365, or show me who my manager is based on my Active Directory, show me who all of his direct reports are. So it's a really nice graph of information that we can get to as Microsoft knows it as our enterprise, okay? So that's the different APIs, the different things that we can talk to. So graph.microsoft.com is the main endpoint. So let's talk a little bit about Azure AD, and then we'll start diving into some of the, I'll start diving into some of the code here. This is, again, just a little sales pitchy kind of slide. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's hosted version of Active Directory. Anybody familiar with Active Directory? Right? Most people have probably heard of it. A lot of organizations take advantage of this. It's not the exact same thing that we have like on-prem in our organizations. You don't have like group policy or joining computers to it. You will when Windows 10 comes out, but for now you don't have that kind of capability. Think about it as today, it's users and groups and applications, as we'll see in a minute. This is just some stats here just showing you how big it's gotten and how many people are actually using it. The key thing, though, that I really want you to take note of here is this last statement at the very bottom. Okay? It says every Office 365 and Microsoft Azure customer uses Azure AD. When you create an Office 365 subscription, they create an Azure AD directory, and that's where all of your users for Office 365, they'll be placed inside of Azure AD. If you also have an investment of Active Directory on premises, there's tools you can set up that Microsoft provides to maintain a synchronization between the two directories so that you can have single sign-on, right? If you want to manage those users, if you have an Azure Active Directory subscription, you marry it to your Office 365 subscription, and then you can see your entire directory. I've done that, and I'm going to show you that in just a bit here with my subscription. So let's talk a little bit here about the authentication model, right? How does this work? So the way that the authentication model works in Office 365 and Azure is that we have a single sign-on type model. Azure AD is built on top of the OAuth 2 specification, and they also have support for something called OpenID Connect. OpenID Connect is a little wrapper around the OpenID protocol. It's part of the open spec for OAuth. And what it does is it says that when you log in, when you authenticate using an OAuth 2 model, one of the OAuth 2 flows, usually all you get back is an access token. What you can also get back, or an authorization code. The other thing that you can also get back with support from OpenID Connect is some additional directory information about the user that just authenticated. So your application can say, go sign in, and when they sign in, when it comes back to the application, it knows not only are you signed in, but that your name is Andrew Connell, and that, well, my name is Andrew Connell, and then it knows your email address and direct reports and all that kind of stuff. And it saves your application from having to do that first one trip right back to the Graph API to find out, well, who is this guy? All right? Everything is based on this. So all the different Office 365 applications are built on top of Azure AD. So one login works for everything. The other nice thing that's cool about this is that we also have an administrative and an end-user consent page. So if I build a custom application, we'll see this in a minute, when I build a custom app, I say this app needs these permissions, just like when you go to Facebook and you go to connect an app to Facebook, and it first asks you, hey, this app wants to do da-da-da-da-da with Facebook. Do you give it permissions to do this? Right? And you get that kind of queasy thing like going, why do you want to talk to all my friends? Right? You get that little feel? Azure AD's got a ridiculous amount of permissions with all the existing applications that it knows about, like Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Yammer, the Unified API. It has a list of all these permissions, and so when the user goes to use the application, the first time they go to log in to this application, Azure AD pops open the user consent page that says, this app wants these permissions. Do you consent to give it these permissions to your data? Now, you're not telling the app, you can go do all this stuff with my data. It's that the app says, now I'm allowed to go do this stuff with your data when you go to do it through the application. Both you and the app both have to have permissions to do that. Okay, just like how Facebook works. Everything's very secure. Like I said, OpenID and OAuth, it's a tried and true protocol. There's no capturing of user credentials. This is a nice part because when you come to my application and go to log in, the way it works is that I say, you go to Azure AD and log in. Don't give me your username and password. You go over there and log in, and then that's going to post back to my application with an authorization code that basically says, it's signed by Azure AD, and it says, we've identified this person as Andrew Connell. Here's a token that you can use to get an access token, a code that you can use to get an access token for calls against other APIs. So the application never gets my username and password. The application just simply gets a message back from Azure AD saying, he's cool. We know who he is. Okay? And there's a bunch of information there. I want to get to my demo in just a sec here. Okay, so we talked a little bit about what is Office 365, what is Azure AD. We talked a little about security. Now, how do I take advantage of this stuff? Now, with OAuth 2, the name of the game with OAuth 2 is we are always trying to obtain something called an access token. And that access token is a JavaScript string. It's called a JavaScript web token, or JWT, which is strangely pronounced JOT. But we have this token, and that token is what we are going to provide to the endpoint that we're making a call to that's been digitally signed. The token's been digitally signed, so when that endpoint gets that token, it can look at that and say, this says it's Andrew Connell, it says it has these permissions, it was signed by Azure AD, it was provided by Azure AD, and it's intended for me. Looking at all this stuff, yes, you can come on in. If none of that stuff matches up, it says, sorry, you can't come in. That's your authentication ticket, in a sense. The name of the game is to get the access token. The OAuth 2 specification defines multiple ways that we can get those access tokens. They're called flows. So an OAuth flow, you might have heard of that. The first one I described a minute ago was called the authorization code flow. That's when you say, user comes to my application, we say go log in, they go to Azure AD log in, come back to the application, he gets a code, he can use that code on behalf of the user to get an access token to make calls out to different API endpoints. The trick here, though, is that when you create one of these applications, every application has an ID and a password. We call them client IDs and secrets, just like a username and password, but it's client ID and secret for the application. What I need to be able to do is I need to be able to take this information and I need to be able to, I have to protect the key, the secret part of my application. I can't let that part get out. Well, if we think about it, we're building an Angular application or a client-side application. That's not possible. Because if we put the key, the username and the password for the application, the client ID and secret, if we put that in JavaScript or we put that in clear text, well, it's clear text. Anybody can get to it. There's another flow called the implicit flow. And what the implicit flow does is it says, we'll just use the client ID, no secret, but that will allow you to go authenticate with a full 100% client-side solution to get that access token and that authorization code from Azure AD into my application. Okay, so how do we go about doing that? The Azure AD team has built this library called ADAL.js. It stands for the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, the JavaScript version. And there's lots of versions of this out there. There's one for iOS, for Android, for .NET, for PHP, for Node, there's tons of them. But what they did for the JavaScript one is they created these two libraries, one called ADAL.js, which is the core of all the logic, and then one for Angular. The Angular one is dependent upon ADAL.js. And what it does is it will look at any request that our Angular application makes by looking at an HTTP interceptor, and it will say, whenever you make a request to an endpoint that matches this domain, or the first part of the request matches this URL, I will automatically make sure that, one, you're authenticated. If you aren't, I'll send you over to go authenticate with Azure AD. And then two, once you're authenticated, I will also automatically include the access or the authorization code with the access token in the HTTP header of every request. So you don't even have to remember to do this stuff in your code. It does it all automatically. The other thing that it does that's pretty cool is it allows me to put a little flag on any of my routes that just says, is this an authenticated route, true or false? By default, they're all set to false, but you can override and say this one's set to true, so it forces me to go to Azure AD to authenticate. That's pretty slick. All right? So a couple different uses of when you would want it. It's going to first watch all the HTTP requests to specific endpoint, and it's going to secure specific routes. Those are the two things I just said a second ago. Okay? So let's forget about the slides, and why don't we do some demo stuff here. Sound good? Okay. I did that in less than half the time. I was trying to get through those slides quick. Okay, so before I dive into the application here, let me show you how I've set this up in Azure AD, and then we'll take a look at how my Angular application, where the security piece of this stuff is. So if I'm going to come over here, I'm going to go to manage.windowsazure.com, which is the Azure management portal, and I have a subscription that I've already set up here. Now my subscription doesn't have a whole lot of stuff in it, so it's going to look pretty barren, because all I'm using this for is really for just this Azure AD setup here. I go create a separate Azure subscription in Office 365 tenant once a month. It's a 30-day trial, and marry them together, so I do all my demos in that, so you're not looking at all my corporate stuff as well. So what this does, the first thing it'll show is it says, here's all the stuff you have, but I'm just going to scroll down just for it to be a little explicit and say, let's look at the Active Directory. It'll show all my directories. I have one directory here called Andrew Connell. I click on this guy, and I go over here to users, and I see, when the spinner finishes, I see I've got a handful of users inside of my directory. Now what that is, if I come over here and I go to my Office 365 management portal, and I log in over here, which shouldn't have to log in because it should recognize I'm logged in on Azure AD, and I go over here to my administrative page, and I come down here to my users and click on my active users, what you'll see is, no, I don't need help, I'm good. What you see here is these users right here are the exact same users over here in Active Directory. The only thing that's special is that these guys have been assigned an Office 365 license. Okay? They're the same people, it's just there's an extra little bit of metadata that's been added to each one of these guys. So those are my users. If I come over here, back over to Active Directory, I can go create an application that I want to be able to have my Angular application talk to Office 365. So let's go about doing that. So if I come over here, I'm going to click Add down here at the bottom, and it's going to say, what do you want to do? So I want to create an application my organization is developing. So we'll give it some name like Angular, you can spell, Angular U app, and it's a web app. And it says, what's the sign-on URL? Well, we're just going to keep it easy and go localhost 3000 for right now. And we got to give it a unique ID. So the unique ID is like a schema for the URL. It's just got to be a URL that is going to be unique to Azure AD and that nobody else is using it. So I'm going to choose one that goes along with my tenant, ACIO 36505 on Microsoft.com/AngularUapp. And a little spinner, it says, yep, that looks good. That domain has to have been validated by Azure previously. Just the same thing you do like every other site where you put a little CNAME in your DNS record, point it over here to some text file. Azure does a check and says, oh yeah, we're cool, we can tell you own it. This on Microsoft.com, that's my Office 365 tenant right there, and so I know that domain's already going to get picked. So I click check, it goes through, it's going to create my application. Spins and spins, we wait. I'm going to come over here to the configure page. So over here on the configure page, we have a name for our application. I've got the sign-on URL. I can change the picture to look like something different. I'm going to skip with this multi-tenant stuff here. There's the unique ID for the application that I just created, this GUID. And then a little bit farther down, I could also assign keys to this as well. So I could say I want to have a certificate that's just 1 year long. I go ahead and click OK. You have to hit save for it to actually create the key. It creates the key. It'll show it right here and says copy and save the key value. You won't be able to retrieve it after you leave the page. They're dead serious about that. If I navigate away from this page and come back, then I just get all stars, and my only option is just to blow it away and recreate another one if I need another one. So you get one chance to grab it. Here's the unique ID for it. What happens when you log in? Where do you go back to? You go to this page right here, but the important part, or the part that's interesting here, is if I come down here and say, let's add an application. What apps What enterprise applications does my custom application I just created, what does it have access to? Right now, it only has access to enable sign-on and read users' profiles. So I'm saying that the user is allowed to log on with this application and see other people within the directory. But I want to say, let's add an application, and I want to add in, wait for it, SharePoint. Oh, that's new. Come over here and I'll say SharePoint Online. So there's SharePoint Online right there, and I'll click OK. And I'll come down and give it some permissions. Things like reading user files. The application I'm going to show you in a second is going to look at my files in OneDrive for Business. So I need to be able to read my users' files. Maybe I want to say they could write to it as well. Maybe I want to be able to read items in all site collections and write items in site collections, and read and write items in lists and site collections. The way that our data is stored, the application you saw Dan run yesterday, the one I'm going to run in a second, all the data is actually stored in SharePoint lists. They're just like little tables in a sense. So I'll do that, and I'll click Save, and it'll go through and assign all those permissions. Now, the only other thing that I have to do to be able to make this work for a client-side application is I have to tell this application that it supports the OAuth implicit flow. Now, today we don't have a UI for doing that. So what I have to do is I have to download the manifest for this application. Download the manifest. There we go. It's downloading it. And then I'm going to come down here and find in my manifest this thing that says allow OAuth to allow implicit flow. I change it to true. I hit save. I jump out of this, and then I re-upload what I just did. I have no idea which one it is. That's okay. We're not really going to use it. Oh, which one is it? Yesterday or today? It's probably today's. It uploads it, and voila, we've got an application all set up here. Okay, now I can go through and now I have an application that my Angular app will be able to log in and authenticate with, and I'll be able to then call the Office 365 API endpoints. There's a few bits of information here that I would need to go grab. I need to know the client ID, so just keep that in mind. Another thing that I would need to know is what is the ID of my Azure subscription? What's the ID of this directory? Where am I going to authenticate? What's the data source of my authentication? The way you're supposed to grab this is if you go down here to View Endpoints, you see a list of all these different OAuth and WSFed and SAML endpoints that we can have. There's a GUID in there, and you want to grab that ID. So I take that, copy it, copy it, come on, there, copy it, and then I just go grab that GUID out. Or if you've done this for way too long like I have, then you can also just grab the GUID right out of the URL right here. It's just right up there in the URL. And there's the ID for my directory. So you're like, okay, fine, why do I need those? Well, before I go any further, let me just show you really quick where our data source is coming from, and then we dive into all the Angular goodness stuff. So I'm going to come back over here to my application, over my Office 365 environment, and I'm going to go to a site called ACIO36505.sharepoint.com Expense Manager. We'll let it spin for a second. And I'm sorry for showing you something completely inappropriate today, which is SharePoint, so I apologize for the vulgar stuff on the screen. I know people are probably scared of SharePoint. I come over here to the site contents. What I want you to take notice of here is that if I go to my employees list, you will see a list of, it's really working on it. It's doing it twice right now. Come on. Come on, interwebs, don't fail me now. There's a lot of people right here. Come on. Page isn't rendering. There we go. There's a lot of people right there. So we're going to show those people inside of our application. In addition, I've also got a bunch of data. If I come over here to my OneDrive for Business site, I've also got a bunch of data inside of this receipts folder. Right? It's an expense reports. So here's all of my expenses. Oh, that wasn't smart. That's, oh, that place has got killer pizza. Anyway. Okay, so let's see what the application looks like then. All right, so I'm going to come over here to my Angular app. Now this, it's just standard Angular app, nothing really fancy in it. If you're looking for a full-blown sample that's all written in TypeScript, it's 100% TypeScript and Angular. This sample is a good one to go grab. It's all in TypeScript. There's a gulp process and everything to go with it, to build it, to compile it to TypeScript, and then run it. I'll do that in just a moment. But let me show you kind of where's the meat and potatoes of this, and I'm going to focus on just the part of this application that is, number one, how do I make it secure and do all the authentication piece, and number two, how do I talk to Office 365? Okay, the rest of it's all just Angular stuff. So here, this is a classic, just creating my application, bootstrapping the guy up, defining my application right here, and then in the configuration phase, down here, I'm saying I have this other file that I've created that's going to look at my expense app and say expense app.adal, call the configure static function that I've defined, pass in the HTTP provider service, a settings object, and this thing called the ADAL provider. The ADAL provider, that's this thing that's being injected in from, that's been defined from the ADAL JS library that Microsoft has created and provided to us. Okay? And that's also available through a Bower package. I've got a Bower package right here. You're looking for something called ADAL-Angular. Right? That's got everything you need to do the authentication I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so let's see where this guy is defined right here. That's inside of app.adal.ts. Okay, so what's happening right here? What I've defined is a static class called configure. And what this guy is going to do is it's going to call the ADAL provider's init function. He's going to pass in a configuration object, and he's also going to pass in the HTTP provider service. What this is now doing is Angular is now being wired up, or sorry, the ADAL provider is wiring itself up to saying, I'm setting up an HTTP interceptor. I want to know when any application, when any request is made for specific endpoints, and when those endpoints are made, you know the application in Azure AD, that's on line 12, the client ID, you know the directory where he lives, that's in line 11, on where to go send this user and how to authenticate. What endpoints does it know about? It knows about those from line 14. And then what happens when I log out? I want you to redirect back to what you see on line 13. So if we look at these constants, all these settings, these are defined in this app.constants file. If you look in here, what this guy's doing here, you can see there's the tenant, there's the ID of my directory that I showed you. I pulled the GUID out of the URL. I also pulled out the ID of the application that I created right there, the client ID. That's another one of my settings. These two things down here, we'll look at those in a few minutes. Those are going to come from my, my Angular services that I've set up. But then here are those different endpoints that I was talking about. Okay? Now, this is a bit of feedback, and this was an unfortunate bit of miscommunication that we could have gotten cleaned up and made a lot nicer with the code, but there was a mistake on committing something to the wrong branch, and then it shipped, and it's like, oh shoot, now the code has been blessed. I'm not a fan of the way that they've done this, but here's how it's set up. The ADAL endpoints is going to contain, it's an object, and this object has a bunch of name value pairs, a bunch of properties. The name part of the name value pair is the URL of the endpoint that the ADAL JS provider should be looking for. So it's looking for any request on line 18 here, any request at acio36505.sharepoint.com/sites/expense manager, and then the entire SharePoint REST API is whatever the URL of the site is you see there, /_API. The value part of that property is the resource ID of the endpoint. And that kind of sucks, because with that, you can't do any nice type checking or any kind of validation there with TypeScript, because the name of the property is always dynamic, right? It would have been nice if it was a collection of things we were passed in that was either a collection of resource IDs and endpoints, but instead they did it this way. So I'm just the messenger. Don't shoot me on that one. And then I have another one here say that's when you're going to the SharePoint API. That's when you're going to the Files API. Ultimately, when we get to the point where Microsoft has the Unified API is much more robust, we won't need two of these. We'll just need one, because it'll all be going to http://graph.microsoft.com. Okay, one to get files, one to get SharePoint stuff. Okay, so that's all I had to do to set the authentication piece up, right? This is when you get this set up and you try it for the first time, you hit, whatever, you deploy it, and you go hit your application, and you see it run, you have this reaction of, I think that just worked. Like, it couldn't have worked. That was too easy. But seriously, that's all we end up having to do to make this whole thing work with Azure Active Directory to authenticate. I'll show it running in just a minute. Here's the other piece of the authentication stuff. If I come down here to my routes, this extra little property is what ADALJS is adding. By default, all the routes have this property set to false when I'm overriding them on some of them to true. So like my login route, that's just the place I want you to be able to go to. When you say login, you click on login, takes you to /login in my application, and that's where I can put a bunch of information that says, hey, you log in over at Azure AD, you're going to get a prompt like this, click here to go start the process, blah, blah, blah. Okay? It's just a little bit of help information. That's an anonymous page. However, these other ones, I want these routes to be secure. Now, I get when we say secure, it's all client-side stuff. You've got the application, you've got the views, you've got the JavaScript. None of that stuff is being secured. It's that the application won't run, it won't work if you're not authenticated, you don't have an access token by this point. Okay? All right, so that's all the authentication piece here. So let's take a look. Let's see this guy actually run. So I'm going to come over here and let's make sure that all of my repos, let's see, pres, where is it? We're in this guy and then demos or demo. There we go. So let's say gulp compile ts. Make sure we have all of our TypeScript compiled. And then I can say, let's start it up on port 8000. All right, so there's our application. Our application is now running, so let's grab that URL. And let's come back over here. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and log out of Azure AD, because if I don't log out here, then when we go to run the app, it's going to log in. We're going to see a quick little back and forth, and it's like, did we really log in? I'm not sure. All right, so let's come over here, open this guy up. Let's go to our application. All right, so this is our expense manager application. So this guy loads. Right now, I'm not authenticated, and we can see that because I'm not authenticated, and we can tell that we're not being forced to go authenticate anywhere because I'm at the /login route. Now, if I click on employees or expenses, those are all routes that require authentication. So it's going to start the authentication process. I could also just click on login. Now, what I want you to notice here is that I'm going to be going from my application, I'm going to leave my application, and I'm going to go straight to Azure AD to go authenticate. So I click on login, it takes me straight over to Azure AD to go authenticate. Right? See, I'm no longer on my application. So I'm not giving the Angular app my username and password right here. So I'm going to go log in using the credentials I had a minute ago, click sign in, and it sends me right back to my Angular app, and it went through and grabbed all the data. If I come down here and look at the request that happened over here, let's refresh this page. Let's go to, which one do I want? That's the options call. So it's using CORS, because we're going cross-domain, the SharePoint API, SharePoint REST API supports CORS, and so it does that pre-flight request here for the option request to say, hey, do you support CORS? It says, yes, I do. Sorry, yes, I do. I support all these things. It goes, great, we'll go ahead and do that for you. It's the browser thing. We don't have to worry about doing that. Here's the request, and here's the interesting part right here. This guy right here, where you see authorization in the request, ADALJS is the one that checked to see what endpoint are you going to. You're going to an endpoint that you told me that you have secured. I'm going to make sure you're automatically authenticated. Yep, you manually authenticated. So I know you're authenticated already, and I've got a copy of your access token living inside of local storage in the browser. So now, when you're making requests to that SharePoint REST API, I'll go ahead and set up your authorization header, and I'll go ahead and include that on any request that's going to go outbound, as it did right here. So now I'm fully authenticated, getting all of this data back from all of these different employees. It's pretty cool. That, when we're trying to do like authentication stuff, it's incredibly easy the way that they've set it up to be able to use Azure AD for your authentication. Here's the cool thing about Azure AD for authentication too. If you don't want to use Office 365, that's cool. If you want to just use Azure AD to authenticate users and get tokens, you can totally do that. It's free. It doesn't cost a dime. You can take advantage of that in your own custom apps. The trick is that when you're going through and creating your own services that you're going to be calling back to get the data back from like a RESTful service, the same way I'm calling the Office 365 APIs, you're just going to have to be responsible to go authenticate or validate that access token that your application is handing over to you to make sure that it was a valid token and it was provided by Azure AD. In this scenario, I'm not having to write any of that code because the Office 365 APIs are the ones that validate the tokens that I'm sending across. If I'm using my own custom services that I write and host somewhere else, I would have to do that. I'd have to make sure that the token was signed by Azure AD. I have to make sure that the token is still valid, that it's not been invalidated. I have to make sure that it's intended for me, because when you ask for a token, it says, I need a token for that resource. So I can't go grab a token for that resource over there and then try and use it for this resource. I'm not supposed to do that. Right? The service that I'm calling should say, sorry, that you didn't get this thing for me. I never said it was cool. No one ever checked with me first. You should be making sure you take that stuff into account. Okay, so how about getting data out? How did I get this data out of here? How did I get these employees? How if I come over to Misko and I look at his expenses? Oh, he probably doesn't want me doing that. So let's come back over. Let's find me. I've got a few expenses. So I'll click on this plus here. And it's taking a second because the first time it hits that files API, if I haven't hit it in a while, which I forgot to do before the session started, it's taking a second for it to warm up for my endpoint. But what it's doing is it's getting a list of all of the different receipts that are inside that files, the receipts folder in my OneDrive for Business. Usually when I explain all that stuff, this has gone quick enough. I gave it enough time. In this case, I didn't. Oh, come on. You're making me look bad. Let's come back over here. Let's try it again. When it doesn't work, you just force it. There we go. And then there's all those PDFs that I showed you in my OneDrive for Business. So how are we getting that data? If I come back over here, let's look in my services folder. And under the data service, this is where I'm doing all of my SharePoint stuff. Okay? So here, just to show you, in the get options, the only header that I'm setting is this accept header. The authorization header is going to be added for me by ADAL.js. I don't have to deal with that. Come down a little bit farther here. How about I want to get all of the employees? This is just a standard REST request. I'm going to use the HTTP service, issue a GET, use the base URL for the list API. That was defined. I set that up here. Here's the base in my constructor. So here's my class constructor, TypeScript class constructor. I'm looking at the settings, looking at the base URL for SharePoint. You saw that in my constants at the beginning. I'm then going to also append /web/list. That's how we get data out of a SharePoint list. You go to the SharePoint site. You go to the API endpoint, which is /_API. You want to get to the list collection. You go to the current SharePoint site you're in. That's /web. And then I go to the list collection /lists. And then I have to tell it what list do I want to get the data from. The employees. That gives me a reference to the container, so I can look at all the properties associated with that. What fields there are, what views there are, what forms are available to me, all that stuff. But I want to look at all the items inside of him, and then it's just a standard OData query. Just select these fields and use these get options. So I'm first going through and getting all the employees, then I'm going to get all the expenses. I execute both those promises, and then as I get all that data back, it gives me all the employees and then the expenses, and I just set it on these different, I just set it right here on, there you go, var employees, var expenses, and then this function here is doing a mapping because the data that's coming back from one list, it's not, the way that we set this one up, it's not like, there's no referential integrity between the two lists. You can set that up, but in this case we didn't. So in this case here, I'm just looking at two different data sources that come back and saying, all right, that goes with this guy, that goes with this guy, that goes with this guy. That's just drawing a map of putting the data together. Okay? That's all we got. That's how we got all of our data back for our SharePoint list. If I wanted to go get data back from the files API, that's over here, my file service. So how does this guy work? He's very similar. This guy, setting up my HTTP header, coming down here, doing the same kind of thing with my constructor, and then to get all the data, I'm looking at the endpoint for OneDrive, and then I'm saying go to the /files/get by path, and I pass in the receipts and look at all the items inside of him. I'm assuming there's no folders in here. I'm assuming there's just files. So I'm just saying give me all the children and pulling all those things back. That's how I'm getting all the data back. Pretty easy, right? The rest of it's just Angular. So my goal here was to show you how easy it is to, number one, build an application that can take advantage of Office 365 data and building an application that has also been secured to run in an Office 365 environment. If they've already been logged in, it'd be single sign-on straight through, really good user experience, and it's stupid simple for us to set this stuff up. The other thing, too, in the last few minutes I have here, I'm going to throw just like, consider this like the Easter egg. How many of you, how many of you sat in Jonathan Turner's TypeScript talk earlier this morning? Yeah. How many of you like TypeScript? How many of you are kind of looking at it with like, I don't know about this, right? And you're like, yeah. Okay, look, let me give you my 2 cents on this. I love TypeScript. But when you first start to start playing with it, you'll get a flat spot on your forehead the first half day you're playing with it, right? I mean, if you try to really buy into it, just playing with types, you're like, oh yeah, piece of cake. But then you're like, oh, I want to go through and use these definitely typed files. And I want to go through and try and do classes and interface and all that stuff. Man, you're just like, this doesn't work. This sucks. My life sucks. I'm going back to JavaScript. ES6 for the win, right? No. TypeScript is one of those things that you have to use, I think, for a few days on a project, and you really got to say, I'm giving this a fair shake. Most of the people that I work with that give it the fair shake are like, you know what, bless you, this is nothing to sneeze at. You think that, this is pretty cool, right? That you do get a lot of value out of it. Dan mentioned yesterday that he and I worked on this project, building out this big application. We did everything in TypeScript, and we both finished. We're like, God, that was really great. What he failed to mention is immediately after that project, we both went our separate ways. We both had to work on a JavaScript-only project, and 2 weeks later, we happened to be talking to each other, and we were commiserating, just saying, this sucks. I want to go back to TypeScript. I liked all that extra stuff that we got inside of our applications. Here's something that's cool. You know when you make calls to RESTful services and you get the data back and you do something like this? We've all done this, right? Make a call, HTTP service, doing a get an endpoint back, I'm getting data back, and then here's the results that come back. How do you know what data comes back? You got to go look at the results. You got to either do a breakpoint, you got to print it out to the console, you got to look at it in the debugger. It's a pain, right? And you got to know what these different properties are. Here's what's cool. You can write an interface, cast it as a specific data type, so that then I could just say, oh, that's a collection of employees. So I could say employees dot whatever, like employee number 1, dot first name, dot last name, and you get strong type data coming right back, all from TypeScript. That's one of my favorite uses of this thing, okay? Just my 2 cents on it. Okay, let me wrap up here because I think I've got about a minute and a half left. I get that probably some of this stuff, some of you might be looking at this going, yeah, I don't really know about this stuff. Some of you may say, I don't really think I followed anything that he said. Some of you may feel like that dude right in the middle, and everybody else is like going, yeah, I like this stuff, right? That's cool. If you have any questions about this, please come up, talk to me afterwards. I'm a huge proponent of this stuff. I will be completely transparent. It's a great source of business for a lot of people out there right now. It's a really good opportunity to get into because especially with Microsoft is really trying to embrace doing much more development off of the server, much more stuff in the client for people to take advantage of this stuff inside of Office 365. Fastest growing product in the history of the company, history of Microsoft. Definitely something to take advantage of because enterprises are there, they got a bunch of money there, and they'd love to give some of it to you as well. Cool? So you can grab the slides. You can also grab the sample that I have right there and go take a look at it. There's also a link in there as well that will even take you to a hands-on lab that I wrote for Microsoft on building that application, where you take the static version of that and you do the Azure AD piece to it for authentication, and you do the stuff to add in calls for SharePoint and the Files API. Right? So cool. Thanks a lot, guys. I appreciate it.